I don't think he needs any introduction, and he's going to talk about robotics in a health context. Yeah, so off you go, Cian. And
Stuart, let me share this. Don't update the driver. Share that screen. Get rid of this one. Okay. Well, first off, thanks for the invite and thanks for the support. This has been I'm going to talk about a paper which is the kind of first really summary paper coming out of this 1 year TAS project, and the governance nodes supported us along the way, particularly Robin Williams, but I guess everybody else, and it's been really useful, the inputs and the various different things you've helped with. So thank you. The project's finished. Finished at the end of March. We're still trying to make sense of it. We're going to present our first paper at the TAS symposium in July. So there's still a lot of things that can go in and out of that. And I guess any thoughts you have today about what's kind of landing, what's sticking, what's useful for you, and where you're coming from would be really useful as I guess myself and the team kind of turn this brain dump into something that's actually useful and a useful academic output. Okay. That's the preamble. Let's get on with it. This is Beaufort Court in Hastings, St Leonard. It's a sheltered housing scheme. It's operated by Orbit, one of the larger housing associations in the UK, or certainly in England anyway. It's got 96 units. It's got more than 100 residents. It's got a shared manager, and they are invested in upgrading their digital infrastructure. Here in this site and elsewhere. They aren't yet introducing robotic systems, but they do have some autonomous, some automated systems and remote digital systems going in there. And this situation and this kind of situation, and you can see the kind of some of the built infrastructure, the age in the photo and so on, kind of has led this team to kind of ask the question of how can robotic systems, if they are being introduced, how can they into environments like this, how can they be introduced responsibly, how can they be embedded within the infrastructures and the social and organizational situations responsibly, and how can they be configured in line with the kind of the wants, needs, desires of both staff and residents who already work there. So this is a paper and a project about how we ensure health and social care staff, professionals are empowered, not excluded by emerging robotics technologies in places like this, or places like wards, and places like domestic settings. So I think over the last couple of decades, robotics research has started to do a pretty good job of centering end users in research and human robotics interaction field, particularly other fields too. We're seeing co-production, co-design approaches emerging, and asking questions and trying to answer the questions posed by the robotics user in this figure. But a still neglected group of users, missing from much research, and certainly a gap we've identified, is the staff. There are often kind of intermediate relationships between technology, services, and patients or service users. So people like occupational therapists, nurses, physios, and others, and decades of I guess, you know, I have a background in innovation studies, innovation policy. Decades of research in that area has told us that as organizations introduce technology, introduce automated technology, there are deep implications for staff. So we want to start getting at these kind of implications for staff, for their training needs, for their skills, knowledge, and their expertise. And one way to start exploring this situation is to think through the different tasks that staff will have to do with robotics, the different knowledge, the skills, the capabilities they'll have to do these tasks. Also, we might think they'll have to know some things about the robotic systems. They might have to know how to do some things with those robotic systems. They might have to know how to assess, evaluate some things, and they'll also have to be able to do things like learn, mediate relationships, as I said, between technology suppliers, between technology fixers and supporters, and the kind of end users, the service users. Maybe we typically see in robotics projects and robotics innovation that seeks to involve end users. So one of the things I guess you could think about what we're doing here is expanding that kind of definition of robotics user, and trying to bring in some diversities there. Focus, as I said, on professional health and care staff. And so what we want to do in this project, in this paper, we wanted to know what are the underlying skills, knowledge, capabilities that will support these kind of hugely varied tasks that are either entirely new or that carers have been doing for a long time, but now may be aided by staff. Okay, why is this important? Why is this work worth doing now? Well, exactly what knowledge, skills, capabilities are needed has implications for the health and care policy in England, in Scotland, and beyond, right? Particularly within and responding to post-COVID digital transformation agendas, where at the very least, new resources, financial and infrastructural and human, have been promised across these sectors. Whether those promises are fulfilled is another matter entirely, but at least we've seen some indication that there are new ambitions. We still know that there are huge vacancies, and these are English figures, across the NHS, across social care, which is in England is an even bigger number of employees and vacancies than the NHS. And to give you an idea of these are the vacancies, but to give you an idea, there's about 1.5 million folks employed by the NHS England. There's about 1.6 million people employed by tens of thousands of organisations across the social care sector. So this is a huge number of people, we think, and we think that their skills, their capabilities, and getting to kind of matters of those as digital technologies, as robotics are introduced, is an important issue. And it's really important in terms of learning, in terms of training, in terms of continued professional development needed along the way. So that's the kind of policy, a kind of broad sectoral governance angle. There's also important.
Cian, can I ask a very quick question, which is what's the average size of a care company?
That's a question I can't respond to. I don't know the average size, Stuart. I know there's a small number of huge companies, huge organizations, and a huge long tail of very small mom and pop style care homes or services. And this is complicated further by, and this is capabilities are important here as well, complicated further by I guess 0 hours contractors, self-employed folks in this sector.
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of 1 and 2 person companies in there, aren't there? And that must be a bit of a challenge when it comes to robotics. But anyway, sorry I interrupted.
No, and please do. I can't see you and I can't see a hand. So if you've got something to say, jump in. Just jump in.
Right,
it's
okay.
Great. It's great. Thank you.
Good.
Okay. So that's the policies. At least that's the health and care policy side. I guess there's another kind of set of implications and that we're interested in here, and that's particularly around agendas for upstream governance of technology, of emerging technology, and for responsible robotics research, responsible robotics innovation, and how we govern, how we make these technologies accord with diverse societal values and norms. And I think in robotics to date, many of the questions have been focused on designing, on issues of kind of designing and developing robots in the labs. As robotics increasingly comes out of highly structured environments, out of factory floors, out of military settings, we're seeing some of the questions of responsible research and innovation head towards these settings, and it becomes a question of embeddedness, and it becomes a question of how can technologies not only be designed in the first instance, but be embedded and configured in ways that ensure ongoing effectiveness, ongoing safety and accountability. And I think I think, and we're certainly trying to play with this in this project, I think that broadens a research agenda for responsible innovation to include issues of skills, issues of user orientation, but also from the methodologically individual, from individual staff, from individual users into more collective settings, service organizational settings, workforce settings, more institutional arrangements around those settings too. So we also maybe see a broadening in agenda here for RRI and responsible robotics. Okay, that's the setup. How did we go about kind of tackling? How do we problematize this? How do we go about tackling this issue of kind of what capabilities matter? Where do we see these capabilities? How these capabilities differ across the sector and with different technologies? So we assembled this very inter and transdisciplinary team of researchers from around England and Scotland, and also partners from Bristol After Stroke, a reablement organisation on the ground in Bristol, and ACPIN, the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists in Neurology, to bring in that kind of professional workforce perspective. And ask this kind of agenda setting question: how can health and social care professionals benefit from using assistive technologies, assistive robotics in ways that are safe, trustworthy, legal, and ethical? In other words, in ways that kind of already accord with their kind of their values, as I said, professional standards and so on already existing. What do we want to do? We wanted to draw up a list of human capabilities, essentially, that matters to folks throughout these sectors and organizations, and to see how and in what situations they mattered. So a little bit about the kind of robotics background here, much of which came from our co-investigator Praminder's kind of decades in the field. We were really interested in robotic systems that were being embedded in care situations, particularly physically assistive robotics, and this really is just to show some of the different kind of task orientations around robots in the care sectors specifically, and how they may accord with kind of different kind of dimensions of needs or dimensions of tasks. In this diagram, particularly levels of assistance, be that socially assistive or physically assistive robotics. And we made a choice. It's just a pragmatic choice, really, in this project to focus in on physically assistive interactions. A couple of notes about those kind of physically assistive robots. We were interested in walking assistance, sit to stand mobility assistance, and they relate to kind of tasks and roles within care sectors in terms of desires to maintain independence, enabling rehabilitation, in addressing at least the promise of addressing care staff shortages, alleviation of physical workload for carers, and indeed the kind of promises of providing diagnostic information for carers. So kind of sensing the environment, sensing the people in the environment, and sensing change in the environment, things that we know robots should be good at doing. So that's some of the tasks and how they aim to complement already existing skills and capabilities. Kind of one other note about the background, and that's understanding, why is this a problem worth spending a year on? Well, this is tricky for a number of reasons. One, because of the complex, dynamic, shifting nature both of the physical, material, infrastructural situations in which these robots are being deployed, and that's the photo, the first photo I showed you of the housing scheme in Hastings, St. Leonard's. These are constantly, just constantly changing furniture, infrastructure like Wi-Fi or phone lines, and we've got the digital switch off happening in a couple of years. That's complicating some of the infrastructures here, but also the people coming in and out of these places. The patients and users kind of complex comorbidities, changing conditions for better or worse. And so these are really, in terms of robotics, really dynamic and unstructured environments. And we think that kind of new skills and capabilities aren't static, right? The need for these are equally dynamic across the piece. So our study, a research question then: what kind of human capabilities will professionals themselves need in order to work alongside robotic systems in the future? And by the by, what kind of hopes and concerns might they have about those future jobs now? A little brief thing on human capabilities. We're taking a kind of a concept, we're broadening a kind of view on skills to kind of a more diverse view of human capabilities. We're taking the work of Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, Ingrid Robbins, people like that, who've developed these ideas in areas such as development economics. Amartya Sen won a Nobel Prize in economics for this work. His goal was to understand diverse people's needs and wants in complex contexts. In other words, or I guess what he was trying to do was make a case against measuring the impact of development aid, so the impact of an intervention, by simply counting the resources provided by the aid agency. In other words, resources such as food or technology in our case do not benefit everyone in the same way, was ultimately Sen's point. They impact people's capabilities in different ways based on a number of factors. So that's a really important kind of situated contextual view of capabilities. We're looking at how capabilities of different people matter in different ways in different contexts. And we take the view that, say, the provision of resources such as knowledge, such as finance, such as technology, such as training, will impact people's capabilities to do what they want to do in very different ways, depending on the starting place, the starting position of those people. Okay, just to put a little bit of example on that, we think people's capabilities to use assistive robots in ways that matter to them hinge on some internal factors and some external conditions to the people. So the internal factors may be people's prior skills, their knowledge, their identity, their experience. External conditions might be the job market. It might be policies, and we talked about the digital transformation agenda. It might be available resources, it might be laws, standards, structured inequalities in society and the way that society and governance responds to those inequalities. So we think these kind of factors influence different people in different ways and how they will use assistive robots. So we can think about the capability to use a robot safely, maybe as one example of a capability. The capability to use a piece of technology on terms that matter to that specific person or that group of people. It could be collective as well. The capability maybe to have a say in what technology is purchased. Right? Why are we using one robot over another, one robotic system over another? Or even more broadly, we could think about capabilities to maintain dignity and dignity of a client while using technology, the capability to finish work at a reasonable hour. So we're really looking for at a broad range here, from a grounded approach. What seems to matter to participants? So to sum that up, we're looking at what matters to folks themselves, so skills, knowledge, specifically capabilities, and we're getting an idea of how to kind of recognize those capabilities and how they kind of match to particular people by the internal factors and the external conditions that people find themselves in. Who are the people that I'm talking about? Well, in the study, our goal was to host a series of events with workshops with people in order to map what capabilities matter to them. We did this across a series of three workshops, and each part of that series had a number of different workshops with different people. And some of the kinds of participants that we had in the structure of that are listed here. Overall, in the project, we talked over and involved over 60 health and care professionals, occupational therapists, as I said, nurses, and physios, interacted with us online and hybrid sessions and in some real world sessions too. And I'll go through a little bit of what we did with them now. In these sessions, we asked, who are you? We got a kind of range of responses. We opened up our sessions through some of our partner organizations and snowballed from there. We had, as you can see here, we had some pharmacists, we had OTs, we also had patients, we had people living with stroke, for instance. We had some of their family members involved too. And we had PhD students and so on. But the majority of folks were working health and care professionals. We asked them in the first instance, for just, leaving technology aside, what capabilities do they already have? What kind of skills and capabilities do folks value in their day-to-day life? And we found that building networks was important. Being able to sustain relationships with patients, critical thinking and testing, assessing problems, evaluating. These were all capabilities, as well as the kind of the lifting, the touching with dignity and care that we would expect. We really did find a wide variety of things that people valued, that they wanted. Building on previous work that Praminda, Linda and Praveen had done, we also knew that there was certain tasks identified with technology use that were important. We tested these and we got these kind of results in terms of working with technology that people thought were important, from handling data appropriately to the end, care and repair of systems, configuring systems. These are all tasks that have to be done in situ, maybe in different ways by different people along the way. And then we got into the capabilities themselves. We introduced people to assistive robots via demonstrations in labs, demonstrations online, videos, and interactive conversations. And we gave people an account of kind of the state of the art in care technologies, assistive care, robotics, and asked what kind of capabilities, what kind of skills would you want? And we got hundreds of anecdotes and responses back from kind of questions about, well, I would have to know about about privacy implications. I'd have to know about kind of physical characteristics of the technology and have a grip on that. To issues like being able to assess risk, to be able to do something, to capabilities to actually do something about it if risks were too high, to be able to apply common sense to situations, to be able to apply experience and interpersonal skills, even if there are technologies there mediating relationships, and so on. So a huge variety of different skills and capabilities of working with technologies, with robotics in care situations. Okay. We assessed them. We used some capability mapping techniques that I won't go into right now because of time reasons, but they're available in the reference list at the end. I'm certainly happy to talk about them in questions. We found 6 broad sets of capabilities that matter to people for working with technology. So a quick recap. What did we want to do? We wanted to scope what kinds of human capabilities empower professionals or would empower professionals to perform tasks of greater skill, fluency, proficiency. And we found 6 clustered. We clustered 6 categories of these capabilities. I'll go through them as quick as I can. The first was for health and care professionals to have human capabilities to be competent and have confidence and self-efficacy. In other words, to be able to do tasks that they have signed up to do, to be able to maintain dignity of the people they're caring for, and to make technologies usable for service users. Some of the examples. Okay, second set of human capabilities was to be able to reflect, to learn, and to implement lessons from the learning. So capabilities to evaluate the impacts of technology, to make sense of that evaluation, and then to do something, to act on what people are seeing in front of them. So capabilities then to recognize and act on people's diverse values and needs. I've talked about the diversity of care settings across England and Scotland, being able to adapt technology and respond to kind of different value sets of staff, of colleagues, as well as organizations, organizational missions, and the people who, say, residents or service users themselves. Capability set 4, to be able to distribute technology fairly, to make it accessible, to be able to care and repair for the technologies and the infrastructures in which they're embedded, to make sure that people on different pathways or in different places around the country had equitable access to technologies. It was a really important issue of fairness and capabilities, right? Number 5 of 6, to have some control over the infrastructures and environments that robotics were being embedded into. We had one robotic system we asked people to assess, which was a ceiling-mounted hoist. Clearly, in that kind of situation, having ceilings, having infrastructure that's strong enough to physically support the robotic system was important. Doorways, carpets, issues like that are important too. But they're only examples of this, of kind of having capabilities to adapt not just to technology, but make sure that the infrastructure environment too is appropriate. And finally, capabilities to be responsible, to hold innovators and technology designers responsible, and to be able to kind of adapt to regulatory guidance, to understand regulatory guidance and apply that regulatory guidance downstream to technologies and ensure they were in accordance with regulatory guidance and with best practice. This wasn't just about those kind of things. So I guess the point of these six non-ideal types, these are clustered categories, there may be some overlap, we're still working on them, was to say, look, expanding these capabilities are a must, right? Or at least cultivating them in the first instance, if assistive robots are to be used to empower health and care professionals.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
A question.
Yeah.
Thanks. Do these capabilities include also, only the final user interacting with the robots, or also managerial people related to managers?
That is possibly the most important question you could ask, and a really sharp observation. I'm going to cover that in probably 1 slide, 2 slides time. So let me get back to that. The short answer is yes, it does include capabilities from throughout organizations, and I'll tell you why. Maybe I'll cover that in a second. Really sharp question. So what, right? Why are these important? And I'll get to that exactly that exact issue and others, right? So how do we ensure health and care workers are empowered, not excluded by these technologies? That's kind of one of the reasons why these are important. So that's a list of capabilities. Other lists of capabilities and skills, including digital skills and capabilities, exists. They're out there. To our knowledge, this is the first that deals specifically with robotics, and it deals specifically with that question you just asked. This deals with people from all levels of the care system. As I said, context is really important, and the skills and capabilities of people who are working in procurement departments, who are working in legal and governance departments of, say, the NHS or of care organizations, of local authorities, have a real impact. And we'd expect that in a complex system, right? We'd expect that something that's happening over here may have an implication over here. So that's a really important, I don't think it's an original finding, but it certainly puts meat in the bones, and certainly I think additive to some of the existing capability and skills frameworks that are out there that don't explicitly deal with this in robotics, we think, from what we've been able to find so far. There's some methodological challenges here. We found it really hard to talk to people about human capabilities. People kept wanting to talk to us about technical functionality. And that's quite interesting to us, and how dominant kind of tropes and frames of technological determinism is. In other words, if we have a problem, we solve it through changing the technology. even talking about the kind of human side of this was quite difficult at times. So we've in the paper we'll have some reflections on that. Okay, the point here though is if we want to boost these capabilities, we need to kind of strategically think about that. We might think about training, you know, as a way to boost capabilities. I'll talk about that in a second. But we also might want to think about the role of standards and embedding some of these findings there, the role of organizational culture to kind of shifting the conditions in which these kinds of capabilities might flourish. Okay, second implication, system-wide training is needed. So again, this system perspective, but it's not sufficient, right? Training is expensive, it imposes burdens on time-poor staff, and this is particularly onerous at the moment, where huge investment at huge cost is needed in sectors such as social care that are already neglected, right? So we put robotic systems in there. Are we also committed to putting in the other interventions that are needed? Cultivating capabilities is also depending not just on training, but on technology design. We can think of the kind of work on affordances and so on there, on infrastructures in which technologies are embedded, and on organizational culture, right? The kind of what's done around here, the practices of organizations, what's rewarded, what's incentivized. So I think one of the things I'd like to do in future research is really look at this triangle of maybe trade-offs of functional design on the one hand, how that talks to the kind of hope, skills, knowledge, capabilities of staff on the other, and it's also kind of embedded in organization practices, incentives, and culture. And I think that's a really interesting kind of triangle of trade-offs. There's a question of levels of autonomy, and I've got 5 of these, and that's it for those of you looking at the time. We've got levels of autonomy and kind of maybe trade-offs between robotic functionality and human empowerment, and certainly with participants in the conversations we had, there was some ambiguity about what level of autonomy systems should be working at, and how this might have to adapt to physical infrastructure, physical conditions of the care setting, and indeed service users themselves, patients themselves. There's a question that comes after that: where should decisions about appropriate levels of autonomy and trade-offs with capabilities be made? Who decides? Quite aside from just simply autonomy issues, this is important because this decision will dictate not only how the robotic system is expected to work, but what the health and care professionals expected to do, to know, and the capabilities they should have. Okay, implication 4 of 5. New framings for robotics assistance are needed beyond technology push. And participants, you know, in other words, we're seeing, I think we've provided some evidence of that goes beyond simply saying people do not want to be replaced by robots, but rather here's some ways people are really up for working with robots, for having a robot as a system in their day-to-day job, but they're going to need certain functionality on the technical side. They're going to need certain investment in capabilities on the human side. And indeed, as we go on, if we kind of take governance of this really seriously, and inclusive governance, listening to what people say, listening to staff on the ground and throughout organizations, well, then we're going to need, I think, new frames of talking about technological assistance and not just substitution and replacement. Very last thing, responsible research and innovation. So probably the most important thing people told us was this: today's professionals said that in the future they want to continue doing what they signed up for in terms of caring for the people they care for. So I think robotics research essentially needs to enable and empower them to do that, right? And part of that is going to be developing capabilities within research. So researcher capabilities to work with care professionals for gaining better understandings of these settings, these dynamics, and so on. The very last thing I'll say to that on this, I think this approach then gives us an opportunity, not just at the program, at a project level. In other words, not just assessing what kind of human capabilities are needed by health and care professionals first, robotics researchers working with them, but what kind of capabilities are needed and need to be generated by programs like TAS, by future programs like the new RAI UK programme that will enable emerging technologies to do what we're saying, to empower, to cultivate, to build up human capabilities in the ways that matter to folks on the ground. We've already done some of this using this technique. We've already, with folks at Edinburgh, we've looked at kind of issues in synthetic biology and reviewed programs there. We think maybe there's, in terms of adjudicating and evaluating, not adjudicating, evaluating maybe some of the responsible innovation capabilities cultivated over the last few years by TAS. Maybe that would be an interesting place to have a look at impact and so on. That's it. I'm going to be in Edinburgh in July talking about this. It's made possible by our partners. It's made possible. What I've said was made possible by the experience and expertise of my colleagues who are listed here. This paper will be presented there. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Are you mute, Stuart?
Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Cian. Yeah, that's great. Questions? I've got a few, but I'll defer asking them until you guys have had a bit of a go.
Yeah. You just. Oh, sorry. Go, Nathan.
So Nathan first, then Andre.
Yeah.
There you
go.
I've got a few questions as well. I'll just start with one. So you alluded to staff training not being at the moment. I just wonder if you appreciate just how truly bad it is. This is anecdotal, so I don't know how well this generalizes. But in my 12 years, I got trained once on one particular medical device out of all the medical devices I ever had to use. The rest of the time, it was just sort of Chinese whispers and working out for myself. This was a number of years ago. I can't imagine that in situations has improved. I imagine it's got worse, if anything. So I'm wondering if instead of taking the approach of, okay, we need even more training, maybe that's an unrealistic goal, that the solution might be to try to make these systems more robust against people with no training, which is going to be, honestly, that's going to be the situation that they're going to have to operate in.
Both. I mean, yes. I don't disagree with anything you've said. I think we started, or my involvement in the project started with, okay, this is going to be about, at the end of this project, we're going to say that not only is more training needed, but here's the kind of training that's needed. And I think that's not what we're saying now. And there's been a change. And I think because of talking to folks, Nathan, who've said some of the things you've just said, maybe not quite as stark as that, and maybe people were being polite in workshop, but certainly saying things like, Cian, do you know how much this costs? This is simply not possible for somebody to pay £600 per day per person for some kinds of training. It's not possible. And so then it goes to, then I agree, it goes to some of the things you're saying. But I wonder, I guess I'm just personally, I'm skeptical of putting all the eggs in the functional design basket there, because things don't ever turn out as intended, right? Technology is never finished, right? It's always reused in life. So even for lots of pragmatic, as good as any technology can be, right? Even with the kind of sunniest disposition. But I wonder, Nathan, if there's other things to be done there, and the kind of, I guess the capability approach is important to me because it brings up issues of empowerment, but it also starts to kind of whisk in issues of power in there too. And as we go from those individual capabilities to collective capabilities, do we have other capabilities to advocate for change, to build up collective action, and to lobby for organizational or institutional change in different ways? And I wonder if that's some of the directions we might want to think about in the future, as well as the functional, and I do think there's a functional issue there, right? And as well as training. But that's my response to that. I hope it.
Yeah. Now, so it sounds like what we really need is almost like a work culture change, sort of the way people approach their workplace, which is it's a hot topic of research in nursing and medicine in general, but it's notoriously difficult to do, to change organizational culture. But I think maybe it is the way to go.
I agree with that. I do agree with that. And I also acknowledge how difficult that is, right? But there's one other thing I think is really important that I've started to, okay, now we're on the I'm thinking and talking thing, but it's this, right? It's certainly in England, one of the features of the kind of post-COVID social care debate has been, we're promised all this money for reform, and over the last 12 months there's been a retrenchment from government, and so actually we're pulling some of this money off the table. And so that kind of cultural change of the training stuff, actually, no, you're not getting as much money as you thought were. And so I wonder how does this kind of research, or the future research that might build from it, does it say anything about status and legitimacy, and how we might make those promises for care really hard to break? Because guess what, that's a really important part of it. So that's, if you've got ideas on that, if you think that's ridiculous, let me know. But that's, in terms of capability building, I think there's a relationship between that capability and legitimacy, accountability, and those other things. But it's work to be done.
Absolutely, I think you're right. But I have a few more questions, but I'll let other people ask their questions first.
Andre,
Hi.
I think you might be muted. Yeah.
I haven't learned after 2 years. Yeah. No, thanks, Cian. I was wondering how they deal with, for example, feedback. I mean, if they are learning pretty much by doing, because this is done day-to-day interactions, did you explore, for any instance, the role of feedback, how that knowledge is captured and distributed among people?
No, not to the extent that I can give you a really good answer for that. I think there's a future research, and I think for me that in part comes under the box of how our capabilities that we've now mapped, and we've seen some of the capabilities we think are important, how are these fostered or cultivated? What role do learning processes like feedback, processes like kind of tacit knowledge build up, formal knowledge, how do they, what role do they play and where? And certainly we did, you know, we did come across anecdotes about different learning styles. When is it, like, say somebody coming back from maternity leave, now I've lost it. Well, so there's lots there to tell me that this is an interesting area, but I don't have the specific roles.
Yeah, but it's in two ways, I think, because not only how to capture feedback, but also how to establish mechanism at the broader organizational level to understand how people it's interacting, and pretty much what you did with your research, but in a broader level, if I understand well. But yeah, they creating this learning system in two ways.
I'm just taking a note, that's really important. But in three ways, actually. There's one other thing I'll say quickly on that is, yes, organization, staff, professionals, but also the service users and patients themselves, and that interaction and the learning between the service users and having them in the room too is really important. That's a definite finding that'll appear in the paper.
Good.
Nathan, do you want to ask a few more, or Andre? I mean, I've got, I don't know, half a dozen, but they're probably all quite quick. But Nathan, you carry on. You know about this context better than any of us. So, or maybe Cian's done a lot of poking. So
I've got one quickish question and one speculative one I might save to the end. Have you looked at cost effectiveness of this at all? Because at the moment, if you have like healthcare workers pretty much working close to the way, they can do all kinds of things. They can chat to the patients, they can clean them, they can shave them, they can assist with mobility. And like I said, they're getting paid pretty low wages to do all of that. versus, I don't know how much these robotic systems are going to be costing, but you have the upfront cost versus, and then the maintenance costs and the training costs associated with that. So you have the idea of when it's going to be sufficiently mature enough to be cost effective to start to go into care homes.
Two responses on that. First response is the capability to assess cost effectiveness was something people told us that they really wanted, and that was a different. And people said even for something like an Alexa or a Fitbit or something like that, because we asked people what technology you use in your practice today. Said I'd like to be able to install Alexas in the homes of all the people I go to, but I don't have the capability to build an argument that will sit with my local authority or sit with. So that in a situated way is already a thing. What was the second? We didn't do a cost effectiveness thing ourselves. But I think that becomes really important as we start to get to the kind of policy side of this and say, look, what, in terms of alternatives, and say this is madness. And in one place we're really thinking hard about is that one of the points I mentioned towards the end is the kind of level of autonomy point, and what price is in increasing autonomy to a marginal degree, right? The research and development expense that goes into that versus embedding, configuring the same technology more appropriately, or upskilling or doing something else. So having those kind of playing with those arguments, and it's going to involve us doing some serious work there. Yeah.
Actually, just another really quick one related to this point as well. Like, do you have any idea of like what kind of assessment metrics you're going to use for this? Because the various health bodies are going to love to have some kind of assessment of we've put this much money in, what's coming out of it. Have you thought about that at all? Because it's quite hard to quantify these sorts of care sort of outcomes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess certainly in England in the 2014 the Health and Care Act, there was the start of a kind of well-being measures and kind of non-typical population health measures, saying, okay, we need to go and do this. Now it's taken until now for those things to kind of start to emerge really properly in statistics. So I think there's some ways in there, because there's part of that is about some version of capabilities. That's our way in. I'd love to hear if you've got ideas for where that can go, though.
Yeah, not off the top of my head, but I will give it a think about it. But I better let Stuart ask some of his half a dozen questions.
Well, maybe Andre, have you got any more? I'm happy to wait, but yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so the capabilities are generic, yeah, or at least they seem generic, yeah. And they seem generic of a carer to some extent, yeah? So in the paper, do you characterize it as a kind of impact on existing capabilities? Because in some sense, those capabilities, to me at any rate, seem to characterize what you needed to be a carer, yeah? And that those are kind of in some sense intrinsic, so you've somehow characterized that. But then the question is, what are the impact on caring for me? Then that reframes the question to what is the impact on caring capabilities of having an autonomous entity in the environment? Yeah, and is that really the question that you're answering, or you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's really sharp, Stuart. So the first question there, I think the important thing, and this is really important, we get this right in the paper. The important thing to remember in the 6 capability sets I gave is that these are sets, right? So these are clustered sets of lots of capabilities. Within those individual capabilities, you will see you will see the technology stuff bubble up in a way that you would say that's not just intrinsic, but it's additive. And I think we need to think about that and how we represent that. So that's the first thing. It's that we're not trying to report simply, hey, this is actually what a carer does, and
No, but it looks a bit like it from the slide.
That's right. Yes, that's
kind of thinking about the presentation a little bit.
It's really useful. So that's a really sharp presentational point to come back to us with, and I think in a longer paper and the very next time I present this work, we'll think about that. The second part of that was really interesting, right? What's the impact? Part of this is, we've had some internal debate within the team about this actually, because part of it is kind of, maybe if we say that the capabilities of say future care work with robotics shift and change, and they now have these, hey, you've got to be able to repair, you got to be able to repair the sensor on the front of the machine, as well as do everything as well as hoisting, right? I mean, that's the cartoonish example, but that to me, as a constructivist science and technology studies scholar, says what it means to be a carer changes and shifts.
Yeah. You see, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is, no, sorry, on you go, keep going.
No, good, yeah. But there's also there's also a question. So that's for me of kind of just seeing what's out there and understanding the world as I encounter, it shifts. For a carer, for a care person, it doesn't shift. This is something new entirely. My role, my subjectivity, as I understand it, stays exactly the same. But that this is an external imposition, maybe, right? So there's a question of how we represent that, particularly as it's a future orientation. This isn't necessarily something we're asking about the future in this research, right? So they're the two things. We could represent that in either way, and but please continue.
You see, I suppose I was thinking, so it's not just that there are additional capabilities, it's the way that the existing capabilities are transformed. So I'm thinking particularly, I mean, these guys have got loads of expertise. I mean, they get shit pay, but they're still extremely good at doing what they do, yeah? And they're going to adapt their pre-existing capabilities. So I'm thinking particularly the stuff Robin is doing on clinicians working with this vinodule scanning thing, yeah? They're adapting their practice around about it, so that now they've identified where they think the vinodule scanning is at its most reliable, and they lean on it there, yeah? But they back off completely when it behaves in another way. So actually their diagnostic practice is changed, yeah? And so having an autonomous agent within there is going to transform people's pre-existing capabilities. So it's not just that they have to acquire additional capabilities. It's rather the much more, if you like, maybe subtle, but probably transformative element is how people, if you like, incorporate an autonomous agent in, so if you have, I don't know, I mean, a while back, people really used to vaunt this Jasper Conran robotic table, that would move around, that would do things for you. But you can imagine how a carer would, if you added a voice capability to that, yeah, you could imagine it being an extra hand, yeah, and actually really quite significantly transforming the way that you do things, yeah. And it's not about using it as a table. It's about using it to change your care practice, yeah, and so there's a whole completely different collection of things that kind of come in at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree there, and that's, you've given me a really juicy way, I think, to cross-cut what we already have. Because there's a point there. There's a kind of a stakes question there, I think, isn't there? And I know in the capabilities literature, folks sometimes talk about nested capabilities, and there may be a kind of a transformative capability for some people to shift their sets of practices and their profession and so in ways that they're happy with. And in other settings, and this is maybe where the analytic stuff, the analytic perspective that we have here might be useful. In other settings, based on certain kind of expectations of visions or certain resources that are available, people can't do that shifting. They can't do that change. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think, yeah, the adaptability though is the key thing there. And
yeah. Okay, so the next thing was, and this is maybe more to do with the presentation. Nathan, when you want to ask your question, when you get bored with things I'm asking, just say, you can just turn your mic on and say, shut up, Stuart, I've got a question, yeah? So that might be right now, yeah, or it might be after this next one. So
after the next one.
Yeah, okay, good. So what I wanted to ask you about was, how did you talk to people about capabilities? Yeah, because I think that's something that you kind of smoothed over in the talk in a big way, and I think if you've got a slide that you can kind of give people an idea, because it definitely wasn't. You didn't go in and say, well, what are your capabilities? Yeah, I mean it's so. But how did you do it? You know, so did you do it with scenarios, for example, to draw out how people would behave, and what sorts of questions did you ask them about those scenarios? I mean, because you could imagine putting people in a scenario and then saying, you have this additional thing, yeah, that could help you in a variety of ways, and how do you think you might use it, or something like, you know. So there's a bunch of stuff about how do you do the probing around what capabilities are. Nathan, you've got your hand up, yeah?
I just want to tag on to the end of that. How did you actually choose them? How did you sample them? Because they're healthcare workers are a pretty diverse bunch, and I can well imagine you getting quite a biased group, depending on how you do your surveying, in that people particularly interested in technology might be the ones who are responding to you, and the technophobic sort of people are the ones who are shying away from you. So just wondering if you took that into account as well as what's your...
Yeah, on that one, that's something we're going to have to acknowledge in our paper, is that there was a self-selecting group who almost certainly did have, I wouldn't say pro-technology, but weren't they weren't super technology averse. Now we had diversities across lots of other dimensions of diversity, but I think there, and what we can check our transcripts and check everything. I think it'll accord with that kind of selection. As I said, we went through organizations' mailing lists. Our partner organizations helped in the first instance. We then went through the mailing lists of other professional bodies, and people were asked to self-select. So that's really important and a sharp question, Nathan. Absolutely. So that's the first one. How did we get at capabilities? Absolutely. I mean, the last thing you want is to ask somebody, say, what's your capability? What capability do you want tomorrow? As I said, we had 3 series of interventions, and in the first series we had focus groups of, probably lowest was, we didn't ever have anybody on their own. We probably had 2s, 3s, up to 6s or 7s of people online, 90-minute discussion. I think we had 7 of those, in which we got at the tasks and practices that people that valued already in their jobs, and we then gave people, Praminda introduced people to a couple of different robotic scenarios of the robot doing things, and saying what kind of skills, knowledge, capabilities. We didn't shy away from using the word capabilities, but we didn't put an academic definition on it. Would you, and we really asked people to imagine themselves in the future, want to have to to work with these, to work alongside, and what kind of concerns would you have? That's broadly that first series. The second series of in which we invited people back, the second series then we hosted in the Robotarium across town in Heriot Watt, and in Nottingham we had hybrid people into that as well. That was much more scenario driven, and we gave I had a slide on it. There wasn't time to give it, but that was much more scenario driven, and we gave, after doing some more robotic introduction, more of from and testing our what we'd found in the first session. We gave, for example, people said, look, you're at home in a suburb of a UK city such as Edinburgh. You are a support worker who provides full-time assistance to Jazz, a wheelchair user, 5 days a week. A new robot has come in here. Jazz has used this before, you haven't. What do you want to know? How do you investigate this? How do you, given what we've talked about earlier, how does this accord with what you want to get done? We had another scenario in which we sent somebody on a trip. They had to bring a robot with them. We were probing infrastructures. We were probing kind of abilities to move around the world, do those kind of things. So, and then we had a final set which asked people to kind of consider reflect on previous studies. So that was good. That was our that's the way we got at eliciting context that matters, shifting dynamic context that matters, as well as motivation, but really the practices and the underlying tasks under them.
Okay, so I suppose I was just wondering about kind of observational studies, looking at how people used, kind of using probes or something, where you add some additional element of automation or something into the environment and see how people's behavior changes in relation to that. I mean, I suppose that's a thing that people have done in the past. I mean, you could even do it with kind of smoke and mirrors things, but the other thing I was thinking about while you were talking actually was, I mean, have you read Sorting It Out by Starr and Bowker?
Not cover to cover, but certainly Starr and Bowker I'm really familiar with, yeah, and the infrastructural stuff, yeah.
Because of course in Sorting It Out it's all about classifications, yeah.
Okay.
And of course there is this 300 category of nursing interventions that were produced. Yeah. So there's a pre-existing categorization of nursing capabilities to some extent. Yeah.
I never put that together. Yeah, interesting.
So I just wondered, I mean, it's old now, but
yeah.
I mean, and of course in Starr and Bowker style, things, I mean, and that did include stuff like humor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the kind of huge irony that Starr and Bowker observe is that categorizations often get used for other purposes. So then they discovered that people were being billed for humor, yeah, because the nurses because they wanted to surface their activity, because it used to appear on US bills for treatment. Nursing was the largest undifferentiated category, yeah. Wow. Most other things were subdivided.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons for doing this was to raise the status of nursing work. Yeah. But then of course what happened was the admin people got hold of it and then said, okay, we're going to record that. So you did 5 jokes with this guy today. Well, okay, that goes on the bill. So there's and of course it's their time, but it's a kind of but I was thinking it's already a pre-existing thing. It's more hospital-based, yeah? But it might still be kind of an interesting thing to look at, because it may very well be that your clusters actually correspond quite nicely to clusters that are already identified by Starr and Bowker.
That's great, sure, thanks.
Then, okay, so I've still got 4 or 5. So this is 2 together, more or less. So one of the things that I felt was lacking from the presentation, and maybe it's there in the paper, is there would seem like there's an insufficient contrast between health and care. Yeah, that in some sense, and there I wondered about what, you know, when you were talking about intrinsic and extrinsic things. Yeah, the question I put in the chat was, where do you put institutions? Yeah. So where does the RCN go? Yeah, because the RCN is somehow both internal and external. Yeah, it's something that is in your heart. Yeah, but to some extent, I don't know, Nathan probably disagree with that, but it's also out there in the public. Yeah, so and in a sense, you know, you look at in the health context, institutions play a much stronger role, and the organization, whatever that happens to be. I mean, Andre's studied a trust, you know, and those have really got their hooks into you like crazy. Yeah. Whereas some little, you know, kind of, well, my father-in-law used to be looked after by a company called Weathered and Treasured. Yeah. And that was one person. Yeah. He used to drive about, you know, he used to work for Mearns. Yeah, they used to work for one of those great big companies. Yeah, and then they spun off and took much more of the payment for them rather than for the shareholders of Mearns. Yeah, I mean, good on her. Yeah, as far as I was concerned. But still, it's a completely different situation, and the whole thing about capabilities is different, and there are different incentives on capabilities. You know, because in the institutional framework, you have an institutional notion of capability, and to some extent, or role, and so on. Whereas in a care setting, then you've got competitive advantage over your others. Yeah, I mean, certainly at the larger end, you know. So the more automation you can introduce, you know. So if you can get automation in there, that means that you get, you know, 5 more care visits out of a person in a week. Yeah. Then, you know, you've got a competitive advantage over the other people. You know, so there's the very different set of incentives to develop capabilities within those two settings. And I wondered whether you'd seen anything of that.
After such an informative question, the answer is not going to be as informative, I'm afraid. Short no is the short answer. Again, part of this is because I think I'll definitely go back and look at data now on this, but in terms of the incentive question to produce capabilities, we didn't ask because we just had to not ask or spend as much time reflecting on how capabilities are built up than we would have liked. We're simply capability. You know, is that a capability that's valued or not? Was the kind of limit of the project. I think you're right about the institutional thing is really interesting, and within the capabilities approach literature, I mean, I'm not sure if there's a divide, but there's certainly there's certainly arguments about how we understand institutions and capabilities. Is an institution a form of collective action, which we could arguably say it is. And I get your point that an institution is, I'm shaking my heart, is in there too, you know. So is it an internal endowment? Is it something that's a resource multiplier or a conversion? Is it a conversion factor, or is it a resource? I guess the capabilities approach would say. That's something for me to think about. I really like your point on the incentive though, and that the kind of how institutions shape maybe incentives. That's the important one for me there, and that difference, that example you gave, that's wonderful. But I don't have an answer on that, and I don't think we tried to get at. I mean, definitely because context was really important to us. So we did get at the. We did try and get the context of where people were coming from, what they were working on, but stepping that up, I think, again, like the kind of training. I think I came in with one view of training. I came in possibly with not thinking as much about organizations and institutions as we've ended up thinking about, and that's definitely where we'd like this to go next. That's where I'd like it to go next, is much more attention. And that as well, you know, in terms of observational studies, that's where you can then start doing situated, not just observational studies, but situated analysis in a much deeper way, but beyond the scope of a 12-month pump primer.
Yeah. And then Nathan, did you want to say something there? I thought you looked as though you were about to say something.
Yeah, just regarding this institutional thinking, I just more of a, I don't know if it's a warning or just a word of caution regarding how thinking can become quite embedded in different ways in different institutions. So you've sort of highlighted this difference between health institutions versus care institutions, and you get this. I've seen this a lot. I guess I've been from the health sort of institutions, being in hospital as opposed to in care homes, but you do see patients get battered between these two. So you have patients in hospital. Hospitals just want to get rid of those patients as quickly as possible. They might be medically fit for discharge, but the social care package is not there in place, but the hospitals just want to push them out as quickly as possible. And then I'm not actually seeing it myself from the care perspective, but for whatever reason, they feel they're not ready to receive these patients, say, no, you can't give these patients, we're not ready for them, but they'll be foisted on them anyway. And then inevitably those patients end up coming back into the hospitals. And so, but no one seems to care, because in terms of, I don't know how they optimize their resource management. You just have these patients getting battered back and forth. And so while it might make sense at some level to have this sort of institutional level splitting of health versus caring, the ground reality, what impacts on the patient is that health and care can't actually be segregated. They are absolutely integral functions of one another. Poor care will lead to poor health outcomes. And they've got poor health, it's just harder to look after yourself. It's harder to self-care. So it's just a caution against having having institutional thinking too sort of divergent. You have to quite quickly try to unify those as quickly as possible. I don't know what practical use that is to you, though.
But it's really, Nathan, but maybe I'll add something there, is to say that I wonder if what you're saying is that there isn't a clear boundary between quote-unquote health and quote-unquote care, whereas actually, depending on how we're thinking, those boundaries might be more or less porous. They might be located at different places. And one of the things there that I think is, that I've really been thinking about in a much bigger sense, is the kind of modernist logics that, you know, the kind of institutional ethos in health settings, and particularly in clinical settings, versus this, sorry about the sirens, versus this really weird in social care, as Stuart's kind of got at, both a quasi-market logic on the one hand, much more so than clinical and healthcare, but also a kind of almost a pre or an aside from modern approach to the kind of relational care, right? And kind of care in the community, and kind of the way that care is an ethic, and the way that's often much more tolerated or visible, I think. And if there's a
that's the one anyway, isn't it? That's really, it's also third sector is the kind of institutionalized version of that. Yeah.
So I mean, and just to say that both of those exist at once on the care side, and where we draw the dividing lines. But I think you're right. I think your point, though, Nathan, about almost, as I kind of interpreted it, about kind of sometimes social care being a kind of a garbage collection for solving the problems of and particularly around pushing people out of hospital beds and clearing the decks, you know, as a kind of a resource bin. And the technologies, the data that go into that, I think, is really important. I'll start ranting if I keep going.
Yep. Okay, Cian, I had 2 or 3 more questions, but I could just ask them all at once. And then
ask them all at once, Stuart, and let's see if I can answer any of these.
So one thing that occurred to me that I mean, this is again a presentational issue, was to characterize how much care work has changed over the past 20 years. Yeah, because you know, you're talking about a kind of big delta in terms of the nature of the capabilities. But I mean, I would say that arguably care work has changed really dramatically over the past 20 years. And actually these guys are change experts, yeah? And that they're not doing the same thing that they were doing last year or the year before or the year before that. They're doing something completely different. And they've all been through COVID, yeah, which was a completely different set of things. So what you've got is you've got something which is, if you like, a phenomenally agile and resilient workforce to some extent. I mean, at the same time, it's fragile because we don't pay them enough. They're in shit jobs. They move from job to job. That lots of other bad things happen one way or another because these people don't have enough money, and so there's all of those things that are problematic. But at the same time, you know, it's certainly wrong to characterize them as not change capable, because they are phenomenally change capable people, and then the question is, how do you contact that or engage with it some way or another? So that's one, yeah. The next one was, of course, the TAS governance node is tremendously interested in explainability, yeah. So is there a whole role for embodied explainability, yeah, like, yeah, because, you know, we talk about, you know, well, a good app, you don't need any training. Yeah. Well, why shouldn't it be that a good robot, you don't need any training? Yeah. Because actually it's able to explain itself. Yeah. Or at least it's able to explain it sufficiently that some person who understands care context will understand why it's doing what it's doing. Yeah. And so I think there's a whole issue about that kind of stuff, and it's not at a techie level. Yeah, I'm thinking about it. It's rather at some kind of how is it that, well, could it be the case that it's possible to design for embodied explainability, or that it's possible to do the service design so that the technology that you have is capable of explaining, so that actually. Because I mean, you're kind of quite interested in co-creation. Well, one of the essences of co-creation is that you kind of understand why it is that something is doing what it's doing, and in an embedded context, you have a much richer context than you do when you're just looking into an iPad screen or whatever, you know. So there's that kind of stuff. So that was in the next thing. So it's what role might there be in that? And then the final thing was, you know, we've been working on this responsibility framework within the TAS governance node. And one of the key things that the thing is, it's all about normative responsibility, or at least it isn't all about norm. I shouldn't say that, because of course Hannah is really interested in causal stuff. But the thing that Bhargavi, my PhD student, has been working on is really fundamentally saying, well, normative responsibility is a key element when we look across the board at regulation. And in some sense, knowing who's answerable for the behavior of the robot is the critical thing. And one of the a lens that you might look at what you've been doing is to say, well, who is it that's answerable in these scenarios with the robot? It has to be a human, yeah. And you know, is it where along the kind of supply chain do you identify who it is that's answerable? And you know, so are there ideas about that now? I mean, is it, you know, because it's clear that if these things have an element of autonomy that the carers grow to depend upon, that they're able to do certain things in certain contexts that are sufficiently trusted that happens, then if something goes wrong, then who is answerable? Yeah. And so there's a kind of issue, and so that's another lens for looking at the problem or looking at the area, I think. Anyway, that's all my questions now. That was it. You know, I got during lockdown, Yeah, we had this series called Design Informatics Seminars, yeah, which are, you know, they can be completely wacky. They can be all about animals or something, you know, just like, and I got into this thing of kind of microblogging the the thing. So I would just be typing in the chat the whole time through the talk. And that's what I still do that. Yeah. So this explains why I've got this list of things. Yeah. Because those all came up while you were talking. Yeah. But anyway.
It's very impressive. And I will say this is the most thoroughly useful paper feedback session I've possibly ever had on a paper. Not a bad question amongst them from everyone. From last to first, I think one of the big things we do have data for, I think, is that carers think that they will be responsible, or they feel an obligation of responsibility already, and in many ways kind of the governance around already existing technologies say that they are going to be responsible. So I think there's a starting point there already to say, hey, if you're installing a hoist in somebody's house, we've, you know, as a society or as a regulator has decided who is responsible. Let's follow that to begin with and see what happens. Might be interesting. And of course that can be shifted. The levels of autonomy things comes in, all the other things you said sure come in, but that's, you know, these discussions have been had along the way.
But by the way, have you read that book called Systems Thinking in the Public Sector?
No, I haven't even heard of it.
By a guy called John Seddon. I mean, it's a very old book now, yeah. But one of the examples he gives is the old lady who had 17 bath hoists installed, one after the other, yeah. Because she would phone up and the call center on the pull down, yeah, the only thing that they had was, the only thing they could map her telling them that she hadn't been told how to operate the bath hoist, yeah, was the bath hoist is broken, yeah. And then, of course, they outsourced the replacement functionality. So it was just a way of making vast sums of money. So the outsourced replacement people just came along, tore out a perfectly good brand new bath hoist and put in a new one, yeah, again and again and again and again. But I think there is an interesting. The reason I mentioned it is there's something interesting about the way that metrics operate. You know, because there's this thing that Catherine and Robin and I have written this little paper about, the McCarthy fallacy, yeah, which is, you know, that where what we do is we make the measurable important rather than the important measurable. And of course, this is something that you see in the public sector all the time. And actually, it's one of the big drivers on the sorts of failures that Seddon talks about in that book.
Let me give you a response to those other two questions quick.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
The first one, questions on questions. The first one I think is an issue of characterization, and it definitely appeared. So this is the point you defended the agility and the kind of not resilience so much, but definitely agility and changeability, right? Capabilities to shift and change and adapt, right? Totally agree. And people told us that. They said, Cian, look, we're really good at it. We don't need training to do this kind of thing. We're really good at this already. Particularly, I think the physios. I can remember a physio saying this. And it's there in one of the cartoons, but we need to bring that out, because we're absolutely not saying that folks can't change or don't want to change. And I think we can tell that story better for sure, right? So that's that one. The explainability one, that's the one that, okay, so I think I had an answer to those two questions. I'm very happy in myself about that. But the explainability one, I think that's more of an idea that I think is really interesting. And I love that. That's exactly the type of thing I like, to kind of bat away the kind of technologically deterministic kind of approach to explainability or governance, and say, actually, yes, maybe there's a way to get at a kind of the social material explainability that kind of runs on capability and practice and embeddedness and the kind of in use type things. That's all I'll say on that. But I really like that. That's something I hope I can make sense of my notes and follow up on.
Good. That's great. Well, I think I've got to go to my next meeting now. So I'm sorry I'm not apologizing. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting, and thanks a million. Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
It was almost a Viva.
Yeah, I felt like that at the end. Much more pleasant than certainly my Viva, which was
absolutely.
Not folks, really, thanks for being so engaging and the invite. And if any of you are in at the symposium, maybe I'll see you there. And
yeah, I'll be there and at the all hands meet as well. Yeah, so I've got to the all hands meet. I've got to present the TAS governance node for RAM. But fortunately, he's told me he's going to give me a set of slides. Yeah, hopefully he won't just say blah 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 blah. Anyway,
well,
okay.
See you later.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks, Andrew. Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye now.